The Christmas Gift. A Billionaire Boss Romance. Misha Quinn. Scene 1. The villa was magnificent. The ultramodern building, whose facade was made of darkened glass, seemed to grow out of a hill surrounded by a snow-covered pine forest. The dark silhouette of the villa was effectively shaded by the red trunks of 30-meter-tall ship pines, whose dense crowns began at a height of 10 meters from the ground. From the spot where a couple of young people stood in front of the villa, it was only visible from the facade. The building was mesmerizing in its unity with nature. Nothing was visible from other sides, and even from afar, neither the huge windows of the bedrooms overlooking the meadow around the villa, nor the garage, hidden under the snow-covered roof that merged with the hill into a single whole. Only those lucky enough to be inside could understand the true size and layout of the structure. In front of the villa stood a young couple, embracing. Graham and Ella were admiring their new home. Tall and robust, Graham touched Ella gently, as if he were afraid of hurting her with a wrong move. Ella put one arm around her companion's waist, and the other against his chest, trying to regain her breath, which was ragged from the fast walk. Only an hour ago, Graham had taken her out of their apartment in the center of the metropolis, in a swanky apartment building on the bay, and driven her out of town. Graham drove the car carefully along roads that looked like black ribbons, in the middle of fields covered with the first snow that had fallen overnight. Graham drove Ella to some inconspicuous parking lot, at the edge of the woods. He parked the car, got out, and opened the door on Ella's side. He always did that when there was a woman in his car. And Ella was the primary lady of his heart now. Ella easily jumped out of the car, and laughing, kissed her lover on the cheek as usual, standing on tiptoe. The couple stepped out onto a path leading into the woods. Ella was surprised that she had nothing to keep her warm during the walk through the snowy forest. They still needed to bring warm, tall winter boots for walking, or a tea or coffee thermos. Despite her surprise, the young woman chose not to say anything to Graham, but simply followed him. Graham took her for a walk, and they went deeper into the snowy forest. The branches of the pine trees that grew around the almost imperceptible path Graham and Ella were walking along were covered with caps of bright snow that glistened in the sun with myriad sparks of sunlight. The purest forest air was filled with the ineffably fresh scent of pine needles. One wanted to breathe fully in such a forest, it was so fresh all around. Ella followed Graham, occasionally stumbling and laughing as he fell knee-deep in the fresh snow at the path's edge. Although Graham's footprints were so large that Ella could have walked over them in house slippers, she did not always step right into them. Graham's footprints were so wide that Ella had to almost jump from one to the other if she wanted to follow his path. So it was easier for her to walk the way she did, which made her stumble and laughingly catch Graham's caring hand on her own, then return to the path and continue. The path finally brought the young people into a clearing. Graham stopped suddenly, turned to Ella, and asked, "Can you see anything over there behind the pines in the clearing?" He held out his leather-gloved hand, pointing to the edge of the clearing ahead, where the forest path seemed to end. Ella stopped and looked at where Graham was pointing. At the edge of the clearing, she suddenly noticed the outline of something that, from afar, looked like several rectangles inscribed into a hill covered in snow. Ella asks, "What is it?" "A house." Graham, smiling rather smugly, hummed, "Yeah. It looks like a house. A villa, to be exact. Would you like to see it?" Still looking at the villa, Ella covered her eyes with her hand, shielding herself from the blinding glare of the light reflecting off the snow of the clearing. Ella continued, "Yes, it's okay to look. But there are no signs saying whose property it is. We may have entered someone else's territory, and they will set the dogs on us, or call the police." As usual, the young woman was cautious and tried to foresee all the dangers, which did not bother her companion. Ella continued her questioning. It's probably someone's private property. I guess we can probably go on ahead and look at this villa, cannot we? Graham answered her confidently. Yes, you can. They do not have time to put up signs about private property. Even from here, you can see that the building is still relatively new. You can see that there's nothing around yet. No garden, no cars, no people living in this villa. We were the first passers-by to discover this beauty. His voice had a certain pride, and Ella thought her lover could buy such a villa himself if he wanted to. But he had never lived in such luxurious villas, at least not since he and Ella had met. Graham, meanwhile, continued his tale of the place. Look, this building is brand new and clearly no one lives in it yet. There are no human footprints around yet, only hare and squirrel tracks. Graham's voice sounded like a child unpacking a new toy. Ella looked at the man of her life with wonder, and realized that much about him was still unfamiliar to her. That quest for adventure, the desire to surprise her, and the delight when he showed her something he'd made himself, like the airplane he'd carved out of wood during his school years, or the sailboat he had assembled from a construction kit his father had bought him. Ella was still amazed that the vast amount of money had not turned Graham into a reclusive or promiscuous man. Such stereotypes about wealthy people were common to many who did not know billionaires personally. She had even married one of them, her Graham, and then divorced him, taking nothing from his fortune. Fate had recently brought them back together, and now Ella was trying to get to know Graham better, so she would not lose him again. Ella took Graham's hand and nodded silently, agreeing with his assumption that the villa was uninhabited. The young men continued to the villa, along the snow-covered path. With every step, the villa came closer to them, in all its splendor. They were not coming toward it, but it was coming toward them. It seemed to float in the snowy sea of the meadow, toward the pair of lovers. Finally, Graham led Ella to the front door of this magnificent building. Ella stopped hesitantly and looked at Graham questioningly, asking, "Are we going inside? Everything here is so new. This house must still be for sale. We should call a realtor. Maybe there's a showing today, and we came uninvited," she said hesitantly, while admiring the house and the black granite terrace where they stood. "We do not need any realtor. I can do it myself." Graham's voice was full of pleasure at its effect, and the anticipation of Ella's impending surprise. He grinned, and pulled a small bunch of keys out of his jacket pocket. He jingled them, and, finding the right key, held it to the electronic lock on the villa's front door. Multicolored lights flashed on the lock, and the front door opened silently, sliding aside along the wall of the building. Graham made a pictorial gesture with his hand, inviting Ella in. The young woman stood on the threshold, unable to control her feelings and thoughts. A wave of warm excitement rose in her chest from the anticipation of something delightful. The heat of uncertainty, of the surprise which she had almost guessed, flooded her cheeks and intensified by the delicate blush from a walk in the fresh air. Thoughts raced through Ella's mind that she could not stop. Graham bought this house. When? But why did not he say anything to me? Though, of course, we're no longer wife and husband, and he does not have to report to me about his purchases or projects. We are now just a couple, trying to rebuild our lives with each other. And he's free to do whatever he wants, with his own money, of course. Ella finally came to her senses, smiled at Graham, stepped resolutely into the lobby of the building, and stopped on its threshold, amazed at what she saw. The whole place was decorated in the style of, Ella did not know what style it was, but she liked it. The villa's interior combined ultra-modern materials and natural wood, tinted almost black. The huge windows of the spacious living room overlooked the glade, and the edge of the pine forest at its edge. A massive fireplace was lit, and comfortable leather sofas and armchairs were arranged around it. Despite the dark tones of the furniture and the decoration of the living room walls, the whole room looked very cozy. It seemed to Ella that the house, the view from the windows, the smell of smoke from the fireplace, it was as if it had been created for her and Graham. Graham followed Ella into the lobby and stood behind her, watching his companion's reaction. When he saw Ella was silent and looking around in surprise and delight, he came even closer to her and touched her shoulder lightly with his palm. The woman woke up from her thoughts and turned around to look at Graham with a smile, muttering, "You have excellent taste, my favorite." "We have. This is our home, you and me. If you do not mind, of course," Graham said quietly, gently putting his arm around Ella's shoulders and pulling her close. Ella turned around, lifted her head, pressed her whole body against his body, and put her arms around Graham's waist. She just could not reach higher, he was so tall. Graham gently lifted her chin and touched his lips to Ella's. The kiss lengthened, and Graham kissed the woman passionately, not letting her slip from his embrace. Ella playfully resisted his insistence, and finally gently but insistently interrupted his attempts to go further in her caresses. "Come on, there's no one here," exclaimed Graham jokingly and grudgingly, looking around the room and still not releasing Ella from his embrace. Ella, resting both hands on his chest and laughing, replied, "And I think our realtor is still walking around the villa somewhere. I think I can hear his footsteps." Graham had already answered seriously. "Yes, the realtor was here just yesterday. Let's see if his things are in the other rooms, and you can see the whole villa at the same time." With these words, he led Ella by the hand to the villa's second floor. This part of the house was decorated in the same style as the living room, but with lighter colors. On the villa's second floor, there were 4 bedrooms and 2 shower rooms. Apparently, it was planned for the owners of the house and their family or guests. Ella and Graham walked quickly through the second floor, not lingering anywhere. Ella's suspicions that Graham would try to make love to her in their future bedroom were not realized. The young woman did not know if she wanted this or not. After all, this house was not hers yet. She had not spent a single day or night here yet. Only after she was a full mistress would Ella feel at home here, and then she could respond to Graham's caresses on the kitchen table. But now was neither the time nor the place to think about lovemaking. Ella was not surprised by the luxurious decoration of the rooms, because she could buy expensive things and furnishings made by the best designers in their country, if only she wanted to. The recent sale of her business had brought the young woman so much money that Ella needed nothing. But Graham surprised her. He had found something she had never had the money for, a villa that would be the envy of royalty. Only one room on the second floor made Ella sad for a moment. It was clearly a child's room. Nothing in it reminded her of children, but Ella suddenly felt a stab of pain in her heart at the sight of the cozy room at the end of the second floor hallway. Some sixth sense told Ella that this was a children's room, and it was for children she might never have again. The pain of loss from the miscarriage years ago came over her again. But Ella immediately extinguished it. Hoping now lived within her, the hope of a new life. The woman remembered that Graham knew Ella might not bear a child anymore. He knew that, and still wanted to be by her and build a life with her. So we just have to live and look forward. Real hope never fades, Ella thought, looking from the threshold of this child's room to her window at the pine trees and the glare of sunlight playing in the crowns of the pines. We just have to live and look forward. No one knows what the future will bring. Ella turned, walked over to Graham, who stood patiently behind her, and hugged him. He looked at her in surprise and hugged her back, resting his chin on the top of her head and touching his lips to her lush dark hair. "What strange creature women are," he thought, as he led Ella back into the villa's lobby.
Until a few minutes ago, she did not want any of this.
And now she's embracing me herself. Yes, that's a real woman, driven by her feelings. My favorite woman. Scene 2. After the villa tour, Graham went onto the terrace, which had a magnificent view of the forest edge behind the house. Ella followed him. "What are you thinking about?" she asks, looking at her lover. "About this house being for the two of us. Or do you think it's too small?" Graham squinted, slyly answering. Ella lowered her head in thoughtfulness, and did not answer his joking question. Just staring off into the distance, deep into the forest. Graham looked at her anxiously. He realized he had inadvertently touched Ella's sore spot. After all, they might never have children of their own. But he was not thinking about children now. He had lived as a bachelor for over 10 years, and had no desire to have children with anyone. But Ella was an exception. She was his passion, his true love. She was the one he wanted to raise his children with. But Graham decided it was better not to think about that now. He should just live for today, and think about the future only from the point of view that suits him now. Children were not part of his plans for the near future. He was a man, and he had his whole life ahead of him. This loss of their expected child with Ella brought him nothing but feelings of loss of something uncertain and unrealized, regret, and sympathy for Ella. But Graham could not fully understand what his lover was going through, so he preferred to wait silently for her to continue talking to him. Finally, Ella awoke from her sad musings and answered, "I think this house suits us just fine. You're good at buying it. I really like it." Graham breathed a sigh of relief and put his arm around Ella's shoulders, whispering warmly to her, "You're my golden one." Graham looked at the field behind their house and realized he had to take the next step, which he would think about soon. And he needed to take that step before he and Ella moved into the house. The young men returned to the house. In the living room, wood crackled wonderfully in the fireplace, and the cozy smell of burning birch wood floated through the room. Ella asks, "Who flooded the fireplace? You were not here today, were you? Or am I wrong?" Graham replied, smirking rather smugly. "Well, of course, I have an assistant. You were right. My realtor came here this morning and set everything up so that everything would work, that the fireplace would be automatically lit by the time we could enter the living room, that all the appliances in the house would work, and that the water in the faucets would be warm." Graham continued his story, ogling the living room with satisfaction. "By the way, this house has all the self-contained devices necessary for us in our home to be completely independent of inclement weather or incidents like power outages. Solar panels and our own electric generator, powered by diesel fuel, and a windmill on the very top of the roof of our house, will ensure our independence from the weather. The house will receive heat from underground heat sources. A well has already been drilled, and a heat exchanger has been installed with underground layers from where the heat is taken. So the fireplace is a tribute to coziness, not a necessity." Ella listened to Graham in amazement. She did not know how difficult it was to provide all these amenities. The young woman was a city dweller, and if she went to her relatives' or acquaintances' homes, they were usually in the city, where water and electricity came from the city grid. So everything Graham was telling her now was causing Ella some anxiety. "How am I going to deal with all this once we settle in here? I understand nothing about the machinery I'll have to deal with here. For example, if the power goes out here because of bad weather, how will I be able to start the diesel generator? How do I know how much electricity is stored in the solar panel battery? And how much electricity is enough?" Graham noticed Ella's confusion and hurried to reassure her. "Do not worry. I'll know everything I need to keep the house in order. And I have the money to order the services you need. So you will not have to do anything yourself." Ella breathed a sigh of relief and, already laughing, replied, "Yes. I'm amazed at how much one has to know and understand when living in isolation. Even in a place as extraordinarily beautiful as this, we will be isolated from the city. But of course, I'll deal with all the equipment that works in this house. Our house," she continued, seeing the amazed look on Graham's face. "But do not expect me to replace blown electrical fuses." Graham, also laughing, replied, "Well, of course you should know how to replace fuses. It's difficult. As for everything else, let's hope everything in the new house will work without problems for quite a while. That's what such a high price is paid for." "And how much? How much did you buy this villa for?" asked Ella, carefully enunciating each word. Graham was not embarrassed and replied, looking her straight in the eye, "For 90 million. Ella looked at him, dumbfounded. "That expensive?" Graham sighed and smugly said, "Yes, it's that expensive. And it's not the price they asked for at first. But I know how to bargain." They were silent for a while. Ella needed time to realize how rich Graham really was. When it was just the two of them, she did not feel that he was important. On the contrary, he did everything he could to be like everyone else: clothes, car, food, everything was at the level of an ordinary middle-income man. Only now, Ella was realizing why he was doing this. He did not want people to build relationships with him because of his money and influence. Graham wanted to be seen as a member of the middle class. So everything he owned was hidden from view. Only his apartment, in one of the most prestigious houses on the bay, with a beautiful view of their metropolis, was in plain sight. But in principle, people with a little more than average income could afford to live in this building because there were many apartments for rent. Ella was still thinking about Graham and this villa. Did he really buy this property because of me? Could we live here together? Yes, that's right. So he's really trying to start our family again. Again. The woman continued her musings, looking past Graham out the window in thoughtfulness. What am I doing? Just following him. After all, Graham was the one who found me years after our breakup and divorce. He was the one trying to rebuild the leased relationship, not me. I'm just following his wishes again. Do I want all of this? The young woman lowered her head, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Ella sobbed, and turning to Graham, she suddenly threw her arms around him and pressed herself against him, her face against his chest. Yes, yes. I want to live with Graham again. He is my love, my destiny. Now I realize how much I need him, not his money, not his influence. I need him for myself, and of course for his sake I'll go through all the trouble, even if I have to change the fuses myself. Graham is worth it. He is the best man in the world, my favorite man. The lovers stood like that for a long time. Graham said nothing. He realized Ella was not only worried about their future, but she was being crushed by the memories of the past, in which the good and the bad were closely intertwined. But this was life, and one just had to move on. Graham hugged Ella tighter and led her away from the house outdoors, into the fresh air and sunshine. The pine trees stood around and seemed to approve that a man could just hold his woman like that, keeping her safe from harm. Scene 3. When the young people returned to the car, they had left behind the pine grove by the big road. Ella's mood improved, and her sadness faded. The woman walked briskly beside Graham, and when she stumbled and slipped off the path, Graham picked her up with a laugh. She jokingly fought back and said, "Thanks, but you know I'm so independent." He answered her. Yeah, I know. But I do not want you to fall in post with your wet clothes and dirty the interior of my new car. So, cracking jokes, they reached the car. Graham, as usual, gallantly opened the car door for his companion, and Ella got into the back seat. She did not want to sit next to Graham. She still wanted to think about the past and the future. Graham drove home in high spirits. He could see that despite the painful memories of the nursery, Ella liked the villa he had bought. Now and then, he would glance in the rearview mirror at Ella sitting in the back seat of the car and see that. Ella looked with interest at the fields, woods, and occasional cottages passing outside the car window. She was still thoughtful, but there was a smile on her face. Graham did not think giving Ella something she would be happy about was easy. He realized that what Ella wanted most of all now was a normal family. In her mind, a normal family meant her husband would come home after a normal workday. They would spend time with the children, running around the house, visiting relatives, and occasionally going to the movie theater. It did not work out in their first attempt to start a family. Perhaps now Graham realized he had to have the woman he loved by his side. And money alone will not do it. In addition, he needs to make some effort to be part of the life Ella believes is the standard for a family. Yes, Graham knew everything there was to know about a normal family. He'd had a good childhood. His parents had given him as much time as they could. And that gave him the self-confidence that won over everyone he had to deal with. That self-confidence was the foundation of all his accomplishments. Graham did not need to prove anything to anyone by making money. He just knew he could achieve the goals he had set for himself. He was worthy of everything he had. And he was worthy of a woman like Ella. His Ella. Upon arriving home, Graham escorted Ella to their apartment, which was so high up that Ella's breath caught every time she stepped into the elevator with transparent walls. As they stepped out of the elevator, the couple walked down the hallway, where they could already hear the joyful barking of their pets, 2 small Spitzes. When they opened the door to the apartment, Graham's feet were caught in a whirlwind of 2 fluffy dogs that pounced on their owners, barking and squealing with joy. The dogs tried reaching their beloved owners' faces to lick them, as a sign that they belonged to their pack. Graham and Ella sometimes doubted who belonged to whom, as their pets were demanding. In addition, the tiny dogs' mealtimes were scheduled by the minute. If no one was home for over 3 hours, Ella or Graham would pour fresh water into a drinker and dry dog food into a machine whose lids would open after a certain time. It was very important for these little dogs to eat several times a day, at a certain regularity of 3 or 4 hours. Otherwise, they had digestive problems. When she entered the house, the first thing Ella did was to drop her lady's bag in the hallway, and, throwing off her boots and outer clothes, go to the kitchen to see what the dogs were eating. All the bowls were empty, as usual. And that was good. It meant everything was all right at home. Graham watched Ella grooming the dogs. Her movements were so precise that he suddenly imagined that this was exactly how she might care for their child. Or several children, already. Graham did not care about the prospect of spending his life without children. He just did not know what advantages it would bring him. He felt it was all too soon for him. Men do not have a ticking clock in their heads, counting down the time until their bodies can never bear a child again. Women do. And for many, it ticks so loudly that any deviation from this rhythm of opportunities that cannot be missed is a tragedy. Graham shook his head and decided he was getting too sentimental. You should not think about what is not there. Not yet. And maybe it never will be. In the meantime, Ella made sure the dogs were all right, had eaten well, and started cooking something in the kitchen, apparently for herself and her man. Graham sat on the couch, leaning back on its soft back, and looked at the television, flipping through its programs and wondering what he should do next. Great, the villa has been approved. But now I must take the next step in order for Ella to be with me forever. And there's no need to be afraid. I'm afraid? Yes, proposing marriage to Ella again frightens me. But I have to make her feel so good about me. She'll never think of leaving me again. I will go with her to all the parties our family and friends throw. I will visit art galleries, museums, and the theater with Ella. Graham already knew that Ella liked to go to exhibitions of contemporary artists, and gradually, he had become interested in the works of some of them. But he did not want to admit to Ella that the work of the rising stars of art attracted him only as an investment, with good prospects for growth over the next 10 or 20 years. Graham did not dare to tell Ella this directly, so he simply went with her to exhibitions and looked at everything offered to visitors. Then he made inquiries with an art investment broker he knew, and through him incognito, bought works by artists. The art Graham had purchased was stored in a special bank vault for valuable objects, and he did not want to tell Ella that he had bought the art and was keeping it as an investment. Graham felt he did not have to tell her everything he was interested in. They were not husband and wife yet, after all. And Graham was also afraid of her reaction. After all, although Ella now had a lot of money earned by her own labor, she did not consider herself pragmatic enough to invest it in art. Therefore, gallery owners did not consider Ella as a client. And since Graham did not distinguish himself by attending exhibitions, they did not know that he was buying works from them, some of which had caught his eye at their shows. So Ella just went with Graham to exhibitions and looked. She never offered to buy or ask about the price of the works. She was just glad that Graham had shared her hobbies and spent more time with her than before. Watching Ella fussing in the kitchen, surrounded by her adoring dogs, Graham realized that this was how he wanted to see her every day when he returned from work or secret missions, a wife who cared for their home and him. Graham finally admitted to himself that it was time to ask Ella to marry him again. He stood up from the couch and strode stiffly along the panoramic window of his apartment.
Yes, we already have a house.
But I still do not have something I can ask Ella to be my wife again with. I need to find a ring suitable for the occasion. She loves artwork so much, it has to be an absolutely extraordinary ring worthy of her and our love. Encouraged by the solution to the problem, Graham spent some time in his home office making phone calls and transactions in his bank accounts. When he left the office, he hurried to the kitchen, approached Ella, and as if nothing had happened, said in a slightly lazy tone,
Honey, you know I have to go away for a while.
I'll be back soon. In the meantime, you get dinner ready. He kissed Ella's fluffy herb-scented hair and stroked her back. The woman stretched languidly, holding the pan and spoon in her hands, and replied, Okay, just not for long. It'll be ready in half an hour. Don't not be late. And went on with her meal. Graham ran into the lobby, grabbed his ID, cell phone, and car keys, and rushed to the elevator. Once inside the elevator, Graham pressed the first floor button and tapped his fingers impatiently on the elevator doors as the elevator slid down, waiting for it to stop at the first floor and open. When Graham finally ran outside, the porter had already given him the car. If Graham left his apartment, the porter would see it and immediately signal to his assistant. He would take it out of the building's underground garage and park it in front of the house. Graham was well paid for this service. Graham got into his car and drove downtown. During the afternoon rush hour, it was a 7-minute car ride from his waterfront location to the city center. Graham parked the car in front of a building that seemed to have been built centuries ago. There, in the huge glass windows of the store on the first floor, a salesman was waiting for him. And not just any salesman, but the store manager. This world-famous store sold some of the most expensive jewelry in this metropolis, and in the world. This store often hosted private shows of works by famous jewelers, famous all over the world, and therefore sometimes seeming almost priceless. Graham knew it was impossible to estimate the value of one large diamond. It could be worth as much as a villa, or 10 villas, all depending on its historical value to buyers. Now Graham was on the lookout for such a treasure. The manager led Graham into an inner room, equipped and protected like the vault of the most secure bank. It was a bank. The only valuables were gems, artwork, and precious metals. Graham waited patiently for the manager in a windowless room that contained a simple desk, the top of which was covered with black cloth or velvet. When the jewelry store manager returned to the room, he was carefully carrying a dark red case trimmed in burgundy velvet or suede. The man placed the case on the table before Graham and opened it, holding the lid carefully. A cascade of sparks splashed in Graham's face, and the man had to cover his eyes for a moment in surprise. But it was just the light of a special lamp, reflected by the skillfully polished facets of a diamond. The light of the lamp, reflected by the countless facets of the stone set in white metal, filled the room, and waves of blue, red, and yellow colors floated across it. The diamond was large, exorbitantly large. The store manager was clearly pleased with the effect produced, and, panting, even said with awe, "Here is your purchase, Mr. Anderson. The very diamond you wanted. How fortunate that we haven't not sold it yet. You called at the very last moment when we—" Graham did not let him finish, impatiently waving away the superfluous words. "Did you receive my payment?" The manager answered, almost bowing to Graham in a bow.
Yes, Mr. Anderson.
We have. The entire amount has been deposited into our company account, as agreed. You work fast. Graham no longer listened to the manager's mutterings, but placed the ring in his palm and balled his hand into a fist. The light in the room immediately halved. "So I'm taking this ring. Right now. You do not have to keep it." The manager, eyebrows raised in surprise, looked at Graham, asking, "You want to take him just like that, unguarded?" Graham stood up, put the ring case in his jeans pocket, and said, "Yes, that's exactly right. Of course, it would be logical to leave a ring of such value in the vault. That's what all reasonable people do. But I am not a reasonable man. I am a man of action. And I take my property with me, unguarded." Graham continued, heading for the exit of the room. "Besides, who else would know about this but the two of us? Only you, or those connected to you. So I know where to look for answers, if something happens to the ring, or to me." Seeing the look on the jewelry store manager's face, Graham relented. "But do not get so worked up, I was joking. Though every joke has its share of jokes, of course. I think someone famous said that." The manager was still staring dumbfounded at Graham, and his voice trembled a little when he could speak. "But you know the history of this ring. The diamond that's set in it, the one it's made of, is that famous Florentine. It's also called the Grand Duke of Tuscany, or the Austrian diamond. It is believed that it was formerly in the possession of the Medici family, then passed to the Austrian emperors, and then disappeared. It disappeared in the last century, after the First World War. And few people know the diamond was split into pieces, from which stones were cut. And this one is the largest of them all." Graham lingered a little longer in the room's doorway, and answered, looking back at the manager. "Yes, I know the history of this stone. That's why I ordered this ring for purchase. I'm not going to give my future wife anything cheaper than this stone. She deserves it and more." With those words, Graham left the room and thanked the manager while bidding him farewell. The man walked briskly across the store's showroom, stepped outside, and entered his car. Graham put his foot on the gas pedal, and his car sped home. Graham felt much happier now than when he'd made the deal to buy the villa, which was worth many times more than the ring. But the villa belonged to him, and this ring, he thought, already belonged to his future wife, Ella. Scene 4. Ella was frying vegetables in a pan when Graham returned to their apartment. The kitchen was filled with the smell of food. Ella loved everything Asian, but knowing that Graham preferred the traditional food of a city dweller in their region, she cooked steaks and potatoes in various forms, boiled, baked, or pasta. Graham liked Ella's cooking. They usually ate a light dinner together, and went to the bedroom to enjoy each other. Graham walked over to Ella and put his arm around her waist. She purred without letting go of the frying pan handle, her back pressed lightly against him at the same time.
What are you?
I cannot right now. See, the food is almost ready. Graham reluctantly pulled away from her and sat down at the dining table. Ella quickly put the prepared food on the dining table. Nothing was fancy. Simple napkins, bread, butter, a couple of sauces, and fresh vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, salad. For dessert, she served a plate of sliced apples and pears of the season. Ella was convinced that all fruits and vegetables should be eaten in season, and eat what grows in your region. Many exotic fruits and vegetables never made it to her table. She did not buy them, and always found something interesting to make at home from local farmers. While they ate, Graham kept wanting to say something to Ella. Still, as if stopping himself, he continued his leisurely conversation about their usual business. The only unusual thing was that they were to move to the villa. But they had yet to decide when they could do it. Ella put the spaghetti on her fork, then brought it to her mouth and caught it with her mouth, which amused and excited Graham simultaneously. He could not wait for them to eat it all and go to bed. Sleeping in the same bed as Ella gave Graham great pleasure. Lately, he'd almost stopped looking at other women, which was almost uncharacteristic not only of him, but of any ordinary man. Usually, any woman aroused some kind of interest in him. Weak or strong, it was the nature of men, and there was nothing he could do about it. Besides, Graham knew Ella paid almost no attention to the fact that he sometimes looked at other women. From the moment they had started over in their relationship, Ella had felt entirely safe around Graham, in terms of who and how he might look without her, or even in her presence. She clearly knew that if he had her back, and was trying to rekindle their relationship after so many years apart, it meant so much more to him than fleeting glances at other women. Ella knew it was her that Graham needed. And if Graham confirmed that to Ella in every way a man could, the woman was at peace. Ella finished dinner and went to take a shower. Graham waited for a moment, then went into the bedroom and opened the door of the secret safe they had installed in the dressing room. He typed in the code, and the door opened. He put the ring in the safe, firmly embedded in the building's wall, and closed it. It's all right, he thought. All that remains is to present the ring to Ella. She is to be my wife, and soon. The best thing would be to ask her to marry me at Christmas. That would be a surprise. And I'd have to do it in front of her whole family. I could not imagine a better present for Ella this Christmas. With these thoughts, Graham also headed for the shower room. Ella was still there, in the shower. Graham undressed and, pulling back the curtain, stepped into the shower stall. Ella turned to him, put her hands on his chest, and ran them down his body from top to bottom. The water poured from the shower over their bodies, warm and relaxing after a busy day. Graham wrapped his arms around Ella, gently pressed her naked body against his, and kissed her lips passionately, ecstatically. Ella kissed him back, and a wave of passion swept over them. Scene 5. The next morning, Ella woke first, exited the enormous double bed, and went onto the terrace. The sun had already risen above the horizon. It reflected gold in the bay's light waves, splashing quietly far below. Ella crossed the terrace, bundling up in a light robe from the morning freshness. She felt a little sick, as if she had spent all day yesterday at the gym and had exhausted herself by working out to the limit. Her body muscles were stiff and sore, and her legs were weak. I must have had too much pasta last night, or the sauce was too greasy, Ella thought. She was familiar with the sensation, and did not pay any attention to it. Otherwise, everything was fine, her stomach did not hurt, and that was normal. She could survive a little food poisoning on her feet. The woman turned to go back into the room, and suddenly staggered back, grabbing the door jamb. Graham had just awakened, and seeing Ella standing in the patio doorway with her head bowed and one hand on her stomach, he jumped up and was at her side in one fell swoop. "What's wrong with you?" he asked caringly. "Are you not feeling well?" No, it's okay," whispered Ella. There was not the usual confidence in her voice though. "It's just the food. Something was of bad quality yesterday. Do not worry, it'll pass. See, I'm feeling better now, so I can go on my own." Ella stepped away from the door and walked cautiously into the bathroom. Graham gave her a concerned glance, saying after her, "Well, if it's okay, then I have to go to work. You know, we're starting a new project, and I'll be back there for a while for duty." Graham continued to be involved in special operations to uncover fraudulent and criminal money laundering operations. He continued to work there, but tried to spend as much time with Ella as possible. Ella accepted and appreciated this new relationship. She no longer resented Graham for not understanding the reasons that made him, a billionaire, work for the Secret Service. Apparently, her man was desperate to be needed by people and his country. And a woman who could live with him had to understand and accept that. That's what Ella did. She thought, if he wants to live that way, fine. Graham respects my life principles and strives to give me everything I need in our new relationship: attention, care, and love. And I accepting Graham completely, with all his flaws, excessive money and excessive social attention. I would have to put up with his ambitions and weaknesses. That was the balance of the family relationship, where each accepts the other for who he is. Graham quietly packed up and left the house to go about his business. Ella was not expecting him until lunchtime, so she did her business. After calling her mother, she took the dogs and drove her small red sports car to her parents' neighborhood. Entering the entryway of the old house where her parents had lived for over 40 years, Ella rang the intercom. She was answered by her mother's ringing voice. "Darling, is that you? Come in, we're waiting for you." Ella immediately went for the old elevator. She did not like all those cable cars in the narrow shafts of old and new houses, and she took the dogs in her arms and walked up the stairs. The heels of her slip-on shoes tapped briskly on the steep steps of the staircase that wound around the elevator shaft, which was enclosed by an old patterned wrought iron grate. When Ella arrived at her parents' apartment, her mother awaited her at the open door. "Well, come on in, honey," said Mom, hugging Ella warmly. "Hello, daughter," came the cheerful voice of Ella's father, who was also waiting for her in the hallway with open arms. Ella hugged her father, let the dogs go to the floor, and walked to the living room, where dinner was already set. Ella's mother was an excellent cook. From the soup tureen, covered with a lid, came the aroma of a pureed soup with some exotic flavor. Her parents' dishes were antiques inherited from their parents and carefully guarded. For Ella, a table set in the best traditions of their family, with a soup tureen in the center of the table, antique silver cutlery, and embroidered napkins, was the norm. But she did not follow these traditions, settling for the simplest things, which Graham clearly did not understand, constantly suggesting that she buy something special for their home. Ella did not want to use a set, and had to make do with simple crockery and cutlery. When Graham suggested she buy a special set of dishes for their apartment, Ella refused, replying, "What happens if one item in the set breaks? Then the set will be incomplete and no longer suitable for guests, and we'll have to buy a new one. But that cannot happen all the time, there's not enough money for all the sets." Staring at her parents' festively decorated dinner table, she thought, "And now that we'll have to go to live in the villa, Graham will obviously insist on buying some fancy set for the guests that I'm afraid to put on the table on ordinary days." But these thoughts were interrupted by a conversation with her parents, asking her about their news. They gasped in surprise when they learned Graham had bought the villa that had been all over the papers lately. Ella's mother said that the villa had been designed by a famous architect, and had drawn mixed reactions from the public because of how it blended into the natural landscape. It was a house for the rich, spoiling a magnificent natural landscape. That was the opinion of the villa among certain sections of society. But Ella did not care about that now. She believed Graham was doing what he thought was right. And as she realized, he was not the one who had ordered this construction. Someone had already built the villa, and he had just bought it. For Ella, this made it easier to perceive the eco-friendliness or otherwise of the estate, and she refused to discuss the shortcomings of this project, even to please her parents and criticize Graham a little. The conversation at the dinner table continued leisurely and in a warm tone, for Ella and her parents had nothing to argue about. Suddenly, Ella rose abruptly from the table and almost ran to the bathroom. Her mother looked anxiously after her daughter. Her mother entered the bathroom after seeing that Ella had not returned to the table for several minutes. She found Ella curled up at the sink, wiping her mouth. Apparently, she had just thrown up. Ella's mother gently brushed her daughter's sweat-damp hair off her forehead, gave her a new towel to wipe her mouth, and said, "Come on, honey. What's wrong with you? Are you sick? When did it start?" Ella, shaking her head, replied, "This morning. I think I ate too much sauce yesterday, and that's why." The mother looked at her daughter, studying her face, exhausted by nausea. "You can rest at our place. You do not need to go anywhere in your condition. Does Graham know you were not feeling well this morning?" Ella answered through the towel still pressed to her mouth. "Yes, he saw this morning that I was not feeling well. But then it went away, and he went to work, of course. I did not know this poisoning would go on. I would not see you so as not to spoil your lunch." Ella's father also came into the bathroom and said, "You're not going to spoil anything for us. Go to the couch, lie down and rest. Then eat something simpler, like rice. Your mom's exotic seasonings sometimes smell too good." Ella's mom playfully swung a towel at him. "What are you talking about? We can go out to eat tomorrow. This is your punishment for not trusting my condiments." While her parents jokingly exchanged accusations, Ella lay on the couch by the TV and fell asleep. Her mother covered her with a blanket and went into the kitchen. Her father also went to the kitchen to not disturb his daughter's sleep. Even in her sleep, she looked haggard, with dark circles under her eyes. Sleeping in the middle of the day was also unusual for her. Their beloved daughter was exhausted. Or she was sick and hiding it. Ella's parents quietly discussed among themselves the reasons for their daughter's ill health. Suddenly, the mother uttered, "What do you think if Ella's pregnant?" Father pursed his lips skeptically, answering, "And what? She could not have guessed that herself." "No. When she was first pregnant, she had no signs or ailments. She only realized she was pregnant because her menstrual cycle stopped. My father, who did not like to discuss such details of female physiology, reluctantly replied, "Yes, anything is possible. Talk to her when she wakes up. It's not for me, you women figure it out for yourselves. All I know is that if we ever have grandchildren, I promise our daughter all the support I can. And do not let Graham dictate how she and her children live their lives. We can give our grandchildren something worthwhile too. Look what a wonderful daughter we've raised." After this tirade, Ella's father retired to his study. After a while, her mother stayed in the kitchen and came out into the living room to look at Ella again. The girl just opened her eyes and looked around, confused. Her mother hurried to explain to her what had happened.
Honey, you just fell asleep.
That's good. That means you'll be on the mend soon. Ella pulled herself up on the couch, still wrapped in the plaid. The mother continued, choosing her words carefully. Ella, do you think maybe you're pregnant? Ella threw up her head in horror and threw back the plaid abruptly.
What are you?
I'm not pregnant. What's the big deal? It's just nausea. It cannot be pregnant, you know my diagnosis. Ella did not want to pursue the subject, and her mother, resigned to a lost battle, told her a little deliberately anxious. Okay, if that's the case. But it's a good idea to see a doctor. Who knows what it is? What if it's contagious and we're all at risk now? There are so many viruses now that are dangerous for people our age. The ruse worked. Ella spoke hurriedly, rising from the couch. Okay. I'll go to the doctor. Just because of you. You talked me into it. And beckoning with a gesture to the dogs to put their collars back on, she continued. Yes. Do not forget you're invited to join us for Christmas at the new villa. I'll tell you how to get there later. We'll send out invitations to everyone who wants to come. Graham wants to have a real holiday for the whole family. Afterward, Ella collected the dogs, still struggling to get around. But she refused her parents' help and said she would go to the clinic herself, where she would have a rapid blood test and other tests for viruses. Ella drove cautiously. She knew from experience that one should always relax and focus on the road. But all the way home, to leave the dogs there, and then on the way to the clinic, Ella shook off the haunting thought that it might be a pregnancy. The mad hope suddenly ignited a fire of doubt in her. What if it was not true? What about the doctor's prognosis, who, after the miscarriage, which had occurred for unclear reasons, had left Ella knowing that she was at high risk of never carrying a child again? Which is true, that prognosis, or is she really pregnant? Scene 6. At the clinic, Ella registered her arrival. She sat down to wait for the results of the tests that the doctor immediately asked her to do. When Ella entered the doctor's office for her initial examination, the elderly female therapist listened to Ella's complaints, her speculation about what it might be, and, looking calmly at the nervous Ella, said, "Let's get the test results first. One examination gives nothing. You may need to have an ultrasound examination by a gynecologist. But before I refer you for this examination, you understand that there are reasons for it. The blood tests will answer our questions fairly quickly. Wait in the hallway, and I'll page you when they're ready. It will only take half an hour." Ella agreed, calmed down a little, and after taking a blood test from the vein, went to the clinic lobby and sat down in a chair by the cozy one. The woman took a couple of magazines and started leafing through them, looking at the pictures, unable to read. Indeed, after about half an hour, the door to the doctor's office opened, and the elderly woman doctor gestured kindly for Ella to return to the office. Ella sat on a chair by the desk, clasping her hands tensely between her legs and bringing her knees together. The doctor did not seem to pay attention to the patient, working on some documents on her computer. Finally, she looked at Ella and, smiling warmly, said, "Congratulations, you're having a baby. You're pregnant, according to the blood test." Ella almost fell out of her chair. "She's pregnant."
Oh my God.
"It's true." The doctor continued. "But it is necessary to confirm the information with a gynecologist. In your case, when you already have some abnormalities in the normal course of pregnancy, permanent pregnancy monitoring is necessary." She handed Ella a paper with some data on it. "Here are the details of our specialist. I just made you an appointment with her. She even has some free time tomorrow. So we are expecting you tomorrow, and you can find out more about what is going on with your pregnancy." Ella walked out of the doctor's office, completely dumbfounded. "I'm expecting a baby. What a joy." But immediately, the fear of loss came over her, for the past negative experience of losing a child still gaped like an unhealed wound in her soul. What if it goes wrong again? After all, last time, they never explained to me the reason for the abortion. What will happen now? How will it go? And how do I tell Graham? Ella found her car in the clinic parking lot and sat there long before starting the engine and driving home. The young woman's soul was filled with feelings ranging from elation to panic and fear of another loss. Only 15 minutes later, was Ella able to calm down enough to get on the highway. However, the young woman did not return home immediately. Immersed in her thoughts, she simply mistook the crossroads of several times and circled around her neighborhood. Finally, Ella drove into the underground garage of her house and, turning off the engine, sat in the car again for a while, thinking, "What if Graham is already home? What should I tell him? How? What if he does not want kids at all? He's told me more than once that he's fine with me on my own. Maybe I should say nothing to him yet. I have to make sure it's really a pregnancy, and then maybe after a while I can tell him. But not now." Ella exited the car and went to the elevator from the garage to the apartment building. The woman walked uncertainly, but this uncertainty was no longer from physical weakness, but from the focus on her future, which suddenly, in an instant, bloomed with bright colors of hope for the possibility of having children. Scene 7. Graham was indeed already home. He was at the stove, cooking an omelet. When Ella entered the apartment, he called out to her, "Is that you?" And, without waiting for an answer, went on merrily, "Of course, who else? Come in, the food is almost ready. Nothing raw this time, just eggs and milk, and everything will be well cooked." He was pleased with himself, and did not even ask how Ella felt. Graham decided she was fine, since his friend had just arrived from her parents. Ella was a mature and independent woman, who knew when to care for herself. Ella left her bag and shoes in the hallway, and walked barefoot into the kitchen. She walked over to Graham and hugged him from behind, clasping her hands on his stomach. He stood at the stove in his homemade clothes, and an apron tied over his jeans, holding a towel and a pan spoon in both hands, unable to respond to her affection. Graham simply asks, "Well, what's wrong with you? Is everything okay?" She replied quietly,
Yes, dear.
"It's all right. It was just food poisoning. It's all right now." Ella pulled away from him and looked into his blue eyes. "It's all right," she repeated. "What did you cook for us? Have the dogs eaten their food yet, or are they waiting for our omelet as usual?" Graham continued his conversation with Ella about household chores, ignoring that she had always been reticent. He put it down to the fact that she had not been feeling well since the morning, and this visit to her parents must have exhausted her even more. After serving the food, Graham sat at the head of the table and gestured for Ella to sit at the side. She had never wanted to sit at the dinner table as a hostess. He was the host, and that was fine with her. Dinner passed in the usual conversations and quiet domesticity of a weekday. When they had finished eating, Ella asked Graham, "So we'll be celebrating Christmas at our new villa?" Graham proudly replied, "Yes, exactly, in our new villa," emphasizing the importance of the word "our" in his tone. He continued, "We need to make a list of everyone who should be invited. After all, we'll be celebrating a housewarming party and Christmas at the same time. Otherwise, I cannot handle two celebrations on close dates." Graham smiled as he said this, glancing slyly at Ella. She sat staring as if she could not see him through him. He touched her hand, interjecting, "So, is that a good idea?" Ella flinched and answered quickly, "Of course it's appropriate. I cannot schedule appointments with people who want to wish us happy holidays every 2 weeks either. And who are we going to invite? My parents and your parents, friends, your friends and mine. Who else?" Graham, having finished the juice from his tall glass, set it on the table, clearly drawing attention to what he was about to say, and said, "Yes, all the family and friends, yours and mine. The villa is so big we could have half the city as guests in it." There was not an ounce of sarcasm in his tone. Graham was ready to organize a wonderful party for all of them, everyone near and dear to them. Ella, with tenderness, almost a whisper, said, "I know how wonderful you are. I adore you. You are the best man in the world." She got up from the table, walked around it, leaned over to Graham, and put her arm around his shoulders. It was a rare occasion when she could do that. His prerogative was usually to put his arm around her shoulders patronizingly and gently. Graham realized that his beloved was genuinely touched by the offer to spend Christmas together in their new villa, and invite as many guests as they could. He patted her arms crossed over her chest.
"Come on, baby.
I'm just a regular person, you know that. But now we have a reason to celebrate as widely as possible, since we've lost so much time trying to spend our lives away from each other. And this will be our first Christmas together after such a long break. So I'm willing to do anything for that." Ella kissed him on the cheek, pulled away, and running her hands over his shoulders, moved away from him to the window. The woman stood there momentarily, as if in indecision, but then turned and asked in her usual tone, "Why do not you go to bed? I'm already tired. I'm going to go to the bathroom first, if you do not mind." Graham replied, "Sure, go first." But he noticed Ella did not offer to join him, and there was not the playful tone in her voice that usually came out of her when she wanted to spend time with him, not just for fun, but with tenderness. Graham did not bother to ask what was wrong with her. He figured Ella was just tired, that's all. Or she was having those days that throw women off balance. She had not informed him of her cycle, but if she had to explain that she should be more careful in bed now, she'd tell him immediately. So he did not need to make Ella make excuses for her condition. If she wanted to, she would tell him later what was wrong. Clearly, she was not in poor health, or she would have told him right away. Graham knew Ella was always there for him when he needed her attention and love. And to maintain that feeling of a warm shoulder around him, he was willing to occasionally delay the need for sex until Ella needed it. Graham sighed as he looked at Ella. She was not in the mood for anything more than a hug. "Oh well, I'll wait. We still have a lot of time together ahead of us." When it was time to go to bed, Ella exited the bathroom in her nightclothes, walked to the bedroom, and went to bed without waiting for Graham. When he entered the bedroom, Ella was already sleeping like a child exhausted from the day. Graham walked over to her, adjusted the blanket, threw it over her back, and stroked Ella's hair lightly. She did not wake up, so he gave in. She should just sleep tonight. Scene 8. When Graham woke up in the morning, he found Ella had long since woken up and was preparing their breakfast. He walked into the kitchen without his clothes on, and assuming the pose of Apollo, caricatured Ella's musculature, playing with his pecs and biceps. Still running around the kitchen with food in her hands, Ella looked at him askew and giggled slightly. And nothing else. Graham realized that any hint he might have had of continuing his bed rest regimen had been rebuffed, and with feigned disappointment, slumped his powerful shoulders and headed for the bathroom. However, Ella focused on her usual morning chores and had no time for him or tenderness. She woke up in bed this morning from a dream in which she felt her body cramping again and warm blood running down her legs. When she woke from the nightmare, she was immediately thrown out of bed by a wave of fear. Still, she was overwhelmed by a pang of hope at the happy news of a pregnancy. Today, she would know if she was expecting a child again. This thought had kept her awake all night, and now her occupation eased the anxious anticipation of the news a little. Ella put breakfast on the table. When Graham reappeared in the kitchen, he was already dressed for the day. Ella walked over and kissed him, but immediately pulled away so he knew nothing would follow. Graham sighed once more but sat down at the table, and they ate breakfast, talking about their usual business. Graham suddenly asks, "Are you going out tonight?" Ella was a little late with her answer, but she had to lie partially. "Yes, I'm going for a walk. I'm going to my mom's. Our conversation yesterday did not go well, as I was still not feeling well. There's something we need to talk about." Graham nodded his head. Understood, but this time eat something simpler. He knew that Ella's mother was fond of exotic recipes and used a lot of spices. He knew that Ella's mother was fond of exotic recipes and used a lot of spices. He had forgotten that her ailment had started yesterday morning. Yes, Ella had lied, but it was partly her way of justifying herself to herself. She was going to the clinic to see the gynecologist and then to her parents. Since her mother had mentioned the possibility of pregnancy, she would not leave Ella alone until she knew whether she was pregnant. To avoid endless questions, Ella went to her parents immediately after the test and told them everything the doctor told her. Most likely, the study would give a negative result, and all her hopes would be in vain. Therefore, the young woman prepared herself for the defeat so that in case of a negative result of the ultrasound study, she would not cry from lost hope, but could bear it all steadfastly. Graham went off on his own, promising to return for dinner at their usual time. Ella was left alone, and after packing her bag, feeding and walking the dogs, she drove her car to the clinic to be there in time for her appointment. After arriving at the clinic, the girl marked her arrival in the electronic system. She waited for a call to the gynecologist's office. The door to the doctor's office opened, and a relatively young woman with glasses and long hair tied back in an old-fashioned bun came out. Ella stood up, dropping her purse as she walked, picked it up and dropped it again. The doctor looked at her affectionately and said, "It's all right, do not worry. Come on in." Ella entered the gynecologist's office, undressed as she had been explained, and lay on the couch. The doctor quickly but carefully examined her, feeling her abdomen with her hands, and said, "Yes, a manual examination shows that the uterus is enlarged." Still lying there, Ella raised her head and looked questioningly at the doctor. The doctor continued, "That means you're pregnant. Week 6. Congratulations. Ella rested her head on the flat cushion of the couch. She was filled with two completely opposite feelings, excitement and fear. How could I not have noticed that my cycle stopped a few weeks ago? What do I do now? How do I tell Graham about this? And what will he decide? Does he want her baby now? Is he willing to endure her nerves and ill health while trying to avoid many risks to the unborn child? These thoughts raced through Ella's mind like a whirlwind. The doctor sat down at her desk again and said, "Now we're going to look at you on the ultrasound machine. Do not get up, it will be done now." Her assistant brought a machine on a wheeled table with many wires dangling. Following the doctor's instructions, Ella relaxed in the gynecologist's examination chair and soon felt something cold enter her uterus. The doctor said, "Hold still. This is a state-of-the-art compact ultrasound machine. Now we're going to see and hear your baby." Ella froze and almost did not breathe. Suddenly, there was a rhythmic noise in the room. Knock, 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 knock. The doctor, smiling, said, "There's your baby. Can you hear his heart beating? Here's his picture." Stunned, Ella propped herself on her elbow and looked at the screen. The gray screen had several dark and light circles, with a tiny dot on one side. Ella already knew what such an image looked like. It was her baby. Her baby. Tears flowed from Ella's eyes. She sobbed and covered her face with her hand, crying and laughing at the same time. The doctor and her assistant waited for Ella to calm down. It was not the first time they had seen such a reaction, from expectant mothers to the results of ultrasound examinations. The doctor allowed Ella to get up and dress, and invited her to sit at the table, handing her a stack of paper handkerchiefs. Ella sat down, excitedly clasping her hands before her and staring at the gynecologist's computer screen. The doctor, of course, noticed her condition and calmly said, "Now, dear mommy-to-be, you need to relax. Learn how to relax. We will show always how to do it. You can sign up for our course for new moms. Your husband can come too. Many fathers-to-be find this knowledge helpful in their family life. Here are the contacts for our group for expectant parents." Ella took the business card with the group's credentials with a trembling hand. Then, still fidgeting with it, she asked, "And how? Is there a threat? What do you think? You know that the first time, the baby did not develop." The doctor looked seriously at Ella and replied, "You do not need to think about that right now. Think about the fact that everything will be fine. If nature allows it, your child will develop normally and be born. Take care of yourself and not let negative worries overwhelm reality. Every pregnancy goes differently. No one goes through the same scenario. So, hope for the best and find the best relaxation method for you in the first 3 months. Beyond that, life will tell you. If your baby develops normally during this time, we will do all control tests. Then, we will only have to observe the natural course of nature. So for now, calm down and go home. Let your loved ones know you need a calm and balanced environment. You need people around you to keep you and your baby happy. Good luck to you, and stay in touch with me. If nothing urgent comes up, I will see you for a follow-up exam in a couple of months. All the best to you." With these words, the doctor gently helped Ella and, putting her arm around her shoulders, led her toward the office exit. Ella walked out of the clinic, overjoyed. So it was true, there was life in her again. Her and Graham's baby, what a blessing. I must tell Graham as soon as possible. But first, Ella went to her parents and tell them the news. Her mom could not hold back tears of relief at the news, and her dad just hugged Ella tightly and kissed her on the cheek, saying, "You, my daughter, you're doing great. Everything's going to be okay. And remember, you have us. We're here for you. Whatever happens in your life with Graham, remember we're here for you. Scene 9. At the very time Ella was listening to the doctor's conclusions about the pregnancy, Graham was sitting at the desk of his boss from the special unit of the country's intelligence service, waiting for a decision on his request for a Christmas vacation. There was nothing to suggest that his services would be required, so he decided to book the vacation in advance to do what he and Ella had planned as early as this morning. A supervisor entered the office. It was the same supervisor who had once recruited Graham to work in a special Secret Service unit dedicated to preventing money laundering and money leaving the country. Graham's extensive experience with all kinds of contracts and banking transactions had allowed him to conduct unusually successful investigations and prevent significant damage that could have been done to the country. His boss, the most experienced and intelligent member of the Secret Service, thought highly of Graham and usually tried to help him, knowing how hard it was for him to choose between his new passion for dangerous missions and his family. You do not have to choose. You just have to make your life fit the way you make it fit, was the motto of Graham's boss. And he understood Graham needed a family life that was as close to normal as possible, or he would snap and either fail another operation or risk his life again, as he had earlier, when Graham had been wounded and had almost lost hope of living. Now, however, Graham had news that concerned him. His unit had just begun a new, extremely important operation, and Graham's participation in it was essential. And taking part meant traveling to the other side of the country, and for at least a month. And that meant that the housewarming and Christmas celebrations with Ella in their new home would have to be cancelled. His unit really had exceptional circumstances right now, and Graham realized it when he saw the adamant expression on his superior's face. Graham listened to his superior in silence. Not a muscle in his face quivered. I am a man, after all. And it was wrong to express my disappointment in front of a boss who always did it when he could help me. Well, I'll have to disappoint Ella and postpone our housewarming party and Christmas together until next year. Well, the housewarming itself at the villa can be celebrated a little later. There's nothing wrong with that. The main problem was that Ella was looking forward to celebrating their first Christmas in their new home. The second problem was that Graham had already planned to ask for Ella's hand this very Christmas. And now everything was going to hell. When Graham came home that evening, he was glum and focused. Ella was glowing with an inner light. When she met him at the apartment door, her eyes glowed with warmth and tenderness. The woman took Graham's jacket and scarf and hung them carefully in the closet. Graham did not even notice it, however, thinking about how to break the unpleasant news to Ella that their Christmas plans were ruined. Finally, he pulled himself together and said, "Honey, you know, I'm going on a business trip tomorrow. And I will not be back until New Year's Eve. I mean, our Christmas and housewarming party does not work out. Sorry." Seeing that Ella raised her eyebrows in surprise but remained silent, Graham continued in the same guilty voice. "It also means you'll be spending your first night in the villa alone. Do not forget that we have to vacate this apartment in a week. I've already arranged for someone to help us make the final preparations in the villa for the move. There's nothing else to do there. We just need to live there." Ella at first froze, not answering anything, but then with a sigh, as if solving some difficult problem in her mind, she raised her dark eyes to him and answered slowly and calmly. "Well, since that's the case, I guess it cannot be helped. I understand, though it's a shame. After all, this is life, and we cannot control what happens in it." Graham stared at her in surprise. He had expected an explosion of emotion, or for Ella to shut up and shut down for the rest of the evening. But she didn't. Something about her had changed, but he could not figure out what it was. She had not even asked where he was going. Maybe he would not have answered, and it would not have surprised her, but it did not occur to her to ask more than what he had just told her. Graham was amazed, but he did not feel annoyed. He was pleased that Ella was calm. So calm, as if she saw something very good far ahead where his eyes could not reach. She sees something good far in the future. But what? But Graham had no more energy to speculate. That Ella had flushed the news so calmly struck him, but it also took a huge weight off his shoulders. It was as if his friend had not even noticed that their plans had fallen apart. Oh well, now I'll have less to worry about, thought Graham. That evening, Ella was as calm as she had ever been lately. Graham thought she would refuse to be intimate with him again, but Ella put her arms around him and pressed herself against him as they lay in bed that evening. Her lips touched his. And everything faded. Their passion extinguished all the lights in the room and carried the lovers away in a whirlwind of love. Graham belonged to her undividedly, and she to him undividedly. They needed nothing more than the warmth of each other's bodies and breath. Scene 10. The following day, Graham packed his small suitcase for business travel. He only took what a man needed on the road. Last in the briefcase was a shaving kit, a straight razor with a supply of dangerous blades, soap, a lather cup, and a shaving brush. Yes, he did not bring disposable blades or an electric razor, but an old-fashioned shaving kit. Graham liked to use natural soap instead of foam when he traveled. It reminded him he was on a mission and had to use the simplest gadgets. There was a certain game of scout in it, but a scout in his early 30s. After all, a little boy in every man likes to hop on one leg, shoot a slingshot, and paw at his mother, begging for affection or candy. It would be hard for Graham to admit it, but he was still that little boy at heart. As he prepared for the trip, he played his special game to help him adjust to the upcoming environmental change. Getting out of the comfort of an ordinary life where he could arrange everything from the best living conditions to surrounding himself with the best services and the people most pleasing to him, Graham wanted to test each time to see if he could cope in life without it all. Had his spirit and body weakened? Was he still a real man or a wimp? Could he do without all these devices used by modern men? Living in the city and leading his usual social life of a successful businessman, Graham was the same well-groomed man, a metropolis resident. But sometimes, he wanted to feel even more fully those primal forces and desires that lead male leaders through life. To do that, Graham needed to isolate himself from conveniences and be alone with a minimum of things, devices, clothes, and people around him. The people he loved, his parents and Ella, needed to stay safe. Graham gathered his things and, fully dressed for the season, walked out of the dressing room to Ella's room and into the living room. The young woman was sitting on the couch, leaning back on the cushion, tucking one leg under her and hanging the other off the couch. Her posture was relaxed and her expression was calm. Graham walked over to her, set the suitcase on the floor by the couch, and sat down next to her on the couch. "So, are you ready?" asked Ella, looking him in the eye. "Yes," Graham answered simply. He did not need to add anything else. He knew that this was a regular business trip, the kind he had a few times a year, and that Ella would do just fine in his absence. Graham had no questions about what Ella did while he was away. He trusted her completely. And he was the one leaving home, not his favorite friend. So why should I have to check what she's doing here? If there's trust in a family, it's just there. There's no reason to be jealous. And if there is a reason, then you have to decide if you still need each other. That's what Graham thought as he said goodbye to Ella. She did not walk him to his car, and remained standing in the doorway of their apartment. The transparent elevator, so disliked by Ella, carried him down to the garage of the building. This time, he did not ask the doorman to get his car ready. Since Graham was going to, it meant he did everything himself and little used other people's services from his everyday life. Scene 11. After closing the door behind Graham, Ella returned to the living room. She sat down on the sofa and stared pensively at the view of the bay before her, as she often did. The morning sun had already illuminated some houses on the opposite side of the bay, coloring them orange. It was the color of cheerfulness, and Ella suddenly felt like she should be cheerful. "I'm doing fine. I have a man I love, and we're going to have a baby." She did not blame herself for not telling Graham the news that had made her shiver with joy. Ella did not think she should worry her lover before an important business trip that she knew had no place for sentimentality. "Oh well, since Graham cannot be with me, I'll organize my own Christmas," thought Ella. She was not one to let despondency overcome her. All the more reason to celebrate, which Ella would tell no one about just yet. Her parents already knew of this happy news, and the rest of the family should say nothing just yet. Graham should be the first to know about the baby, and only then everyone else, family, friends, and workmates. This was especially important to Ella because she did not want to take another load of ahs and ohs from friends and acquaintances to listen to their sincere or not so sincere wishes for happiness. After all, Graham had brought not only love and luck into her life but also envy. And now Ella wanted to protect her child from unnecessary attention. She had to figure out how to build her life first. And the advice of others, except for the closest people, she did not need now. All that mattered was Ella's own well-being, her mental balance, and the love of the people closest to her, her parents and Graham. Oh yes, and her pets, how she had forgotten about them. Her Spitzes also loved her and loved her unconditionally, something you cannot say for people sometimes. Ella picked up her cell phone and looked through her contacts. She had to send invitations to everyone who could come to the Christmas party. It was a little disappointing to have to tell everyone that Graham would not be there. Of course, the post immediately after Ella sent out short invitations to her Christmas celebration, a slew of questions like, "What about Graham? Why would not he be here? Are you still together?" Yes, that was Axe. Any change in Graham and Ella's relationship interested everyone who knew them. Many of the people they knew well remembered the couple's unusual love story and sincerely wished them happiness. Although some women they knew could keep in the recesses of their souls the thought of whether this attractive billionaire was still free again. Could one already lay claim to his private time, usually so densely occupied by Ella? Or perhaps one could not only claim his time, but his fortune as well, if one got to know him better. It took Ella almost an hour to answer the questions from the invitees. Finally, she got through the correspondence and moved on to sending out the invitation cards she and Graham had already purchased the other day. The young woman sat down at Graham's desk, arranged his antique writing instruments around her, a massive writing instrument made of polished semi-precious stone that included an imitation inkwell, a glass for pens and pencils, and a paper holder for notes. She took one of Graham's favorite ink pens, made by one of the finest manufacturers in the world, and began diligently tracing the letters on the invitation cards. The address on them was already printed on their order, but Ella wanted to write the text of the invitation in her own hand. For her, it expressed attention to the person she was inviting. She spent old-fashioned time and effort on each invitation. Yes, Ella liked to handwrite, especially with such a good pen as she had now borrowed from Graham. And that she was now sitting at his desk, writing with his favorite pen, felt significant to her. He was there for her, although he had just left. He was there for her. Him and their child. A couple of hours later, all the invitations were issued, and Ella had postage stamps affixed to their envelopes. "They're all done," she said aloud to herself, twirling the thick stack of envelopes with satisfaction. "Now we can carry them off and drop them in the mailbox." Ella got dressed for going out, put leashes on the dogs, put all the invitation envelopes in the bag she was taking with her, and went outside. The sun was already glowing. The trees, still bound by the morning frost, seemed to thaw right before my eyes. Water dripped from some of the brown leaves still on the branches. The colorful grass on the lawns was shriveled and damp with frost, like a carpet that had just been washed but forgotten to dry. Ella walked down the street toward an intersection where a mailbox was set up to accept envelopes of correspondence. She picked the one labeled Express and tossed a couple dozen invitation envelopes one by one. Closing the lid of the mailbox, the young woman breathed a sigh of relief, spun around on her boot heels, and with a little tug on the dog's leashes, headed back toward home. She felt a little nauseous and needed something to eat. This new feeling was unsettling to her, but she realized that the most important thing now was to follow the doctor's recommendations and avoid any anxiety. This time, her baby would be fine. She would do everything to be calm and think now, not only about herself but also about what their baby required. The last time she had been pregnant had been a complete surprise, and it was also a surprise that at first this new condition had not caused her any unusual sensations, except that her monthly cycle had stopped and her breasts were a little heavy. And then, her breasts felt lighter, and another checkup with the doctor showed that the fetus's heart was no longer beating. After that, I just had to wait it out, and the miscarriage came on its own a couple of weeks later. It was a terrible feeling when you realize that your body is getting rid of what could have been your child. So now Ella was excessively listening to every unusual sensation in her body. She knew she should not be doing this, but she could not help herself yet. Maybe it's better that Graham is away. It's better that he knows nothing yet, and I'll try to deal with my doubts and feelings during the time he's away, the young woman thought. In such thoughts, Ella walked leisurely down the alley, leading her dogs on leashes and occasionally tossing fallen wet leaves off trees with the toe of her shoes. Fall was ending, and this dark time of year, when everything seemed to die, and it was so dark and wet, without fresh snow around most of the day, she needed to get through it and be strong. To be strong for herself, for Graham and their baby. Scene 12. 3 weeks had passed. Graham was working on a project, surrounded by a team of special agents like him. He had gone through all the training necessary to earn the title. However, after his injury, he was still reluctant to be given assignments that required physical force. Each time his boss denied Graham a referral to the active part of the assignment, he replied, "We need your brains, Graham. We've got muscle, and that's the easiest thing to get. And your experience and skills plus your intuition, you cannot find that in a day's work. So stay where you are and do your part. You're too important to us to risk your life on a field operation again." Graham walked away, swallowing his resentment, but then he realized he was no longer in his 20s. When the young guys who had been molded into the special agents of their unit were jumping around, he could not compete with them physically. Yes, that had to be recognized. So Graham, as before, analyzed the situation more and worked out ways to stop illegal actions against his country's property. This time Graham could not concentrate on the task at hand, and his boss could see that. When the main actions of catching the criminals were done, the boss approached Graham and, patting him approvingly on the shoulder, said, I can see you're having a hard time concentrating. Graham raised his head proudly, like a thoroughbred horse intending to object. Still, his boss squeezed his shoulder harder, urging him to be silent, and continued. Don not even thinks about it. I'll make a deal first. The boss eyed Graham the way a sculptor would admire his work of art. I can see everything. Apparently, there's a good reason your thoughts are more preoccupied with your personal life than this project. Nothing, it's done well. And as a good leader, I must admit that I pushed your ego a little too hard back then when I communicated the need for this trip. We all have a part of our lives where work has no place. So, you can go home for Christmas. Right today, if you want to, of course. The boss looked at Graham with undisguised pleasure, and his face took on a happy, dazed expression. Then Graham smiled, grabbed his boss's hand with both hands and shook it vigorously in gratitude. The boss was even taken aback, but he was also clearly aware of the effect his decision had on Graham, who was renowned for his equanimity and collectedness. Yes, love does wonders to men, thought the boss, looking at Graham, who raced toward the exit of their premises with another brief nod of thanks to the man. Well, good luck with married life, his boss wished him, turned back to his team and went about his more mundane business. He needed to keep working on their project. No one was expecting him home for Christmas. It was all in the past for him. Scene 13. Graham ran into the hotel room where he was spending the night or day, depending on how their special operation was going, and began quickly dumping his clothes from the closet hangers into the suitcase he had thrown open on the bed. He was not going home that fast, probably ever. When all his things were packed, Graham checked the bathroom, scooped up all his toiletries and dropped them unpacked into his suitcase pocket. Almost on his way out of the hotel room, he patted the pockets of his jeans and leather jacket. Yes, I have all the paperwork with me. Now I can finally drive the car straight to the airport, he thought, and headed resolutely away from the hotel room. This was the only way he could make it home before Christmas. He glanced at his watch, only 23 hours left before Christmas. Let's go. Graham ran out of his room without waiting for the elevator and ran down the hotel stairs to the porter's desk. The porter, seeing his guest's obvious hurried to check out and accepted the keys. Graham grabbed from the hotel reception desk all the papers that the hotel clerk had so badly timed and ran out of the hotel lobby and into the parking lot. No one had time to give him his car, and he did not need to. Graham opened the door of the car he had rented for the business trip, checked the navigator on his phone, and drove onto the highway toward the nearest airport. He had already booked a ticket for the desired flight from his hotel room, checked in online, and all he had to do was pass the pre-flight security check, and he could go straight to the plane. After hastily dropping his car in the rental car lot, Graham ran into the local airport building and went straight to the automatic check-in counter. He did not have to check in his luggage, so he simply confirmed to the machine once again that he was there. After confirming the check-in, he took quick steps to the window of the car rental company and handed the car keys back to the landlord. Everything was done quickly. He had so far kept up with everything, and everything was going according to plan. Graham passed the passenger security check, and half an hour later was sitting in the cabin of his flight home. The stewardesses showed with practiced gestures instructions about behavior and safety on board the plane, reminded of the need to be buckled up at least during takeoff and landing, and even better, during the entire flight. The airplane's engines roared outside. The airplane crew checked the operation of the engines and ailerons on the wings of the airplane. Graham sat in the aisle and looked out the window, where it was getting dark. The lights of the airplane brightened the gray field of the airport. The other planes were parked in the parking lots, and did not seem to go anywhere. Graham suddenly realized that he still had sent no word to Ella or his parents that he was coming home, and expected to be home in time for Christmas. However, he changed his mind about sending them anything now. Better to do it all in person, upon arrival at the site. It's better that way, he thought, closing his eyes and resting his head on the back of the airplane seat. He wanted to give all his loved ones as nice a surprise as he himself had got from his boss that morning, so he decided not to. But when Graham glanced again at his phone, which he had not yet turned off before the flight, he saw a message from the local emergency services about a storm front that was hitting the coastal areas of the country. Graham glanced out the window. Everything around him was unchanged, the same gloomy weather and gray clouds looming over the horizon. There was no wind, not even a drop of rain. This is all nonsense, thought Graham, closing his phone and turning it off for the duration of the flight. I'll be there in 3 hours, and no storm can stop me. The airplane taxied to the starting strip, waited for a while as if trying out its muscles before flying. The engines roared even harder, and Graham was pressed against the seatback. The airplane ran down the runway, the seatback tilted even more backwards. Graham realized that the front wheel of the plane had come off the tarmac, and then the plane stopped shaking, and it slid smoothly, sharply upwards. They were taking off. All was well. Graham closed his eyes and fell into a dream. Everything's going to be okay now. Scene 14. Ella was decorating the Christmas tree her dad had helped her buy and bring home. The tree was almost 2 meters tall, and Ella had to stand on a chair to decorate it. She was suddenly dizzy, which was quite unusual for her. Ella was afraid of falling or jumping to the floor, remembering that she must not put the baby at risk. Ella quickly but carefully got down from the chair to the floor, sat on the chair, and waited for the dizziness to disappear. With this state of pregnancy, I have to learn to get along and prevent situations where there might be some risk to my health or the baby's health, she thought, coming to her senses from the dizziness. After rocking in her chair for a while, she continued decorating the Christmas tree and asked her mom to help her hang the toys on the tree. The Christmas decorations were all the same ones her parents had used in her childhood. Handmade horseback riders galloping around the tree like a merry-go-round, and big red glass balls decorated with glitter and patterns. Ella had chosen multicolored lights because it was more fun that way. The sunlight played with all the colors of the rainbow, and it brightened up the living room of her and Graham's apartment, where Ella had set up the tree. The Christmas tree lights sparkled with a metallic sheen and gave the sensation of pouring water, which then froze into snow at the tree's base. There, Ella decorated a snowbank, which she adorned with shiny clear snowflakes, and laid out gifts wrapped in colorful pieces of paper and tied with red satin ribbons. Ella still needed to find a gift for Graham. Still, she had prepared small gifts for everyone invited, her parents and Graham's parents, their friends and colleagues who might also drop by her party. She'd invited over 30 people, and it was scaring her a little. What if they do not come? After all, the meteorologists had promised some kind of snowstorm for today. Not everyone would dare to drive or even use public transportation in this weather, just to spend a couple of hours in Ella's company. And without Graham, she thought, as she completed her preparations for the Christmas celebration. Ella was prepared, because only her own family and friends would come to visit them today. And the others would decide to wait until Graham was in place, and see them sometime later. Ella realized she little interested those interested in Graham's society. For some, she was even a nuisance. Being very observant, the young woman could see how the women sometimes glared at her as if she had stolen their rightful prey. But she does not care. She is sure of herself now. She was convinced that Graham loved her, that he really loved her. And all those unfulfilled expectations of other women stay inside them. She does not care. And since Ella had told no one but her parents that she was pregnant, it now seemed that today was the day she would see who in her circle she was essential to, in her own right. She felt that if she had told the other invitees that she and Graham were expecting a baby, everyone would see them, and more. A baby brings a family together, if that family is normal. And since Graham was so eager to rebuild his life with her, their child should be a sign that Ella was moving from being a friend to the mother of Graham's child. And that changed everything. Ella, in their eyes, would no longer be a woman whom Graham could still give up quickly enough for some adventurous and his fortune. Now, in her new status, in the eyes of everyone around her, she would be entitled to a share of Graham's fortune through their child's rights. But Ella did not need that either, for she had enough money to raise her child properly. Ella referred to their baby in her mind sometimes as their, or yours. Until Graham knew they were having a baby, she hesitated to say the phrase, our baby, even to herself. She had to see how Graham would take the news first. After all, a person's first reaction is usually the most natural, especially to such a significant event in a couple's life as a common child. So Ella was looking forward to the moment she could tell Graham they were having a baby. Of course, it'll be after Christmas when he gets home from this sudden business trip. So Ella was not expecting anything out of the ordinary this Christmas. May it pass quietly and without adventure, like it used to when I used to spend Christmas at my parents' house and with my friends. Thinking this way, Ella continued slowly setting the dinner table in their spacious living room with dishes and decorating it with various Christmas trinkets. In the center of the table, she placed an antique candlestick on which she set thin, red candles. The guests would arrive soon, and she had to prepare the food she would serve them. Ella's mother began to worry whether Ella was overburdening herself with these worries. However, seeing how calmly Ella did everything, she decided not to interfere in preparing her daughter's house for the guests, and only helped when Ella asked her to do so. By 9 o'clock in the evening, everything was ready. Finally, the first intercom bell rang, and Father Graham's cheerful voice came through the speaker. So, are you accepting us with gifts? Ella replied with undisguised joy. Good evening, of course, come in, and opened the front door for them. The receptionist graciously greeted Ella's guests, and respectfully escorted them to the elevator. Ella turned to her mom and, still grinning, said with relief, Here we go. She ran her hands over the apron that covered her simple but elegant outfit for an evening at home, took it off, and headed into the living room. The festive dinner table looked perfect. Now her first real guests would take their seats, and then more would come and more. The evening would be just as she'd envisioned it. Not without Graham. Ah, if he could be here with me. But it's impossible. And even if he dared to come, if he even could, I'd ask him not to, for a blizzard is coming. The meteorologists have promised actual piles of snow on the roads in their state for tomorrow. Those who reach her tonight can stay here tonight, warm and safe. She'll have a place for everyone to lie down, even on the floor. It'll be all right. Scene 15. The airplane shook and jerked so violently that Graham woke up. He stretched and looked out the window of the airplane's porthole. Everything outside the plane was gray-white, and part of the window was covered with ice. Well, the storm has started after all. Graham thought calmly. It did not frighten him. If the plane took off, it would land somehow, surely it will land. Pilots are excellent at what they do. However, Graham did not know what awaited him in the next half hour before landing at his destination airport. The wind increased, so landing the airplane at their airport was impossible. The captain of the ship changed the route and landed at another airport. The ground navigation service dispatcher suggested to him. The airplane tilted sharply to one side and made a 180-degree turns. The flight attendant informed the passengers that the route had been changed because of bad weather, and they were heading to another airport located further inland. Graham straightened in his chair. He was not frightened by the situation, but he was suddenly terrified that his plan to spend Christmas with Ella was going to hell. But there was nothing Graham could do about it. He waited tensely until the plane, rocking like a dinghy in the turbulent flow of the mountain river, somehow miraculously found the landing strip and landed. Other passengers clung frantically to the handrails of their seats. Some prayed aloud or clutched the hands of their companions. Some, like Graham, just sat tensely erect in their seats, waiting for the shaking and chattering of the huge airplane in the blustery winds of the approaching storm to end. Finally, after several unsuccessful approaches, the airplane crew landed the plane on the landing strip. The passengers clapped when the huge machine, which had just been tossed about like a straw boat by the gusts of a blizzard, stopped at the receiving gate for their flight. Some even shouted "Bravo" to the captain and crew of the airship. It's all over. They are on the ground. But where are they? Before the passengers were released from the cabin, they were told that the airline would arrange rooms for them at a local hotel, and anyone who wanted to wait to continue their trip until tomorrow could stay there at the company's expense. Graham, along with the other passengers on that flight, exited the cabin of the airplane, greeted by the captain and crew. People passing the airplane's cockpit cheered the pilots and thanked them for their skill and courage. Graham walked down the dimly lit corridor of the small airport to the waiting room. There, they were greeted by an excited young airport manager and offered an overnight stay at a local hotel, paid for by their airline. Most passengers accepted the offer, and people dragging their luggage followed the local airport employee towards the hotel, which was just a couple of 100 meters away from the airport. Only Graham remained standing in the lobby of the airport lounge. He would not spend the night. His navigator showed that it was only a couple of hours by car from this airport to his hometown. So he went to the rental car counter, where the company manager was asleep at the window, his head resting on his arms on the table by the computer monitor. Graham tapped on the counter, and the young man straightened up with a startled gasp. "Good evening. What can I get you?" he asked, wiping his sleepy eyes. He clearly was not expecting any customers tonight. Such severe weather out there, outside the walls of that building. Only a completely insane person would be driving. And apparently, that was the madman standing in front of him. Graham realized it was necessary to speed up the young manager's train of thought, and spoke in the imperious tone of a man accustomed to leading. "Good evening. I need a car and it's urgent. Here are my details. Check my card, it's in your company's system. I'm a regular customer. And please hurry." The young man realized that someone very important was in front of him. He quickly took Graham's card and checked his information. Then, with a change on his face, he jumped up from his chair, rushed to the car key locker, and quickly found the right key. It was their best car, a heavy SUV with four-wheel drive. The guy almost reverently handed Graham the car keys and asked, "Do you want me to show you how to start it?" Graham realized now he would lose more time and replied, already walking away from the counter, firmly but with respect for the lad's zeal. "No, thank you. I can handle it." The manager waved his hand in the direction where their parking lot was, and only shouted to Graham to follow. "That's the one, the biggest," implying it's the biggest car in the parking lot. Graham opened the car door and glanced at its instruments and controls. Then he confidently started the engine and set off. A snowbank blocked his way immediately as he left the garage. But the all-wheel drive SUV confidently overcame the obstacle, and, sometimes slipping into the slip, still moved towards the highway toward the metropolis. Every time, Graham thought he might be swept into the oncoming lane, or that one driver would lose control and run into him. But he persevered and kept. However, it became increasingly difficult to move along the highway. There was so much snow that ordinary cars just stopped on the roadside, and anywhere else. There was a huge traffic jam of cars ahead of Graham, which could not go any further. Graham tried to find every opening among the cars to get further and further ahead. He was waiting for the graders, who were about to come through to help clear the highway of snow, and all the cars could move forward again. And he should be ahead of them. Finally, the orange lights of a grader flashed behind them, and a string of these powerful machines swept past them, sweeping snow from one lane of the highway to the other. Some cars parked on the side of the road were additionally swamped by a shaft of snow. But Graham was prepared for this development, and caught when he could get his car out of the snow captivity and follow one of the snow graders. By the time the other cars that had stopped on the side of the highway could move forward again, Graham was already far behind. He had pulled in just behind the last grader. He followed it, keeping a safe distance but using every minute to cover another kilometer. After all, this was his way to Ella, his beloved future wife, for whom he had bought the best gift in the world, a mysterious ring with a long history stretching centuries into the past. Scene 16. The large living room was filled with people. A tall, fluffy Christmas tree shone with flashing lights in the room's corner. On the floor in front of the tree were piles of presents. Their colorful wrappings were tied with red or shiny ribbons and decorated with snowflakes. On the huge panoramic window overlooking the bay, garlands with lights were hung, creating an incredible expectation of something very festive and pleasant. All this was incredibly cozy against the storm raging outside the window. It was impossible even to open the door to the terrace. Such attempts resulted in the snow being immediately brought into the room by the gusts of wind. Ella sat at the head of the table. She felt like the center of attention. And that made her a little uncomfortable, after all. All the seats at the table were taken by the older guests, Graham's parents, her parents, aunts and uncles on both sides. The younger guests, mostly Graham's and Ella's friends from work and school, took seats where they could sit more freely, sofas, armchairs. Some even sat right on the carpet by the Christmas tree. Why, that's good too. They took food with them on plates. Sometimes, someone's glass with a drink would be knocked over, or something would fall from the plate onto the floor. But there was only a burst of laughter, as everyone was in high spirits. Even though it was already known that Graham would not be at the party, Ella could see that people saw her and Graham at home. So what if we did not get to host guests at that villa Graham bought? That can all wait. Right now I'm celebrating Christmas with family and friends in the apartment Graham and I have. Yes, all the guests Ella had invited had come. She had not expected it, and now she thought she had doubted their familiarity for nothing. Now they appreciated not only Graham, but her. Ella looked around the living room, which was filled with people. The feeling of need and recognition made her feel so good that she almost cried. But what is it with me? Crying just for no good reason. That's not my style at all, she thought, furtively wiping away a tear. But then Ella remembered that in pregnancy, all a woman's reactions were heightened, and this emotion reaction was also a consequence of her situation. Hormones change in the body, and all responses are not quite the same as in a normal state. But Ella did not want to be in a normal state. She was so happy to know that she had this secret, the new life she carried inside her. Ella looked around and was the first to make the toast. She tapped her fork on the empty crystal glass that stood by her cutlery, and almost shouted in a ringing voice. "Dear guests, pay attention." People gradually fell silent. All eyes were directed at Ella. She got up from the table, pushed her chair back a little, and continued. "Thank you all so much for joining us for this celebration. You know that Graham and I had planned for it to be normal." Ella emphasized the word, as if laughing at its meaning. She continued, smiling. "But as you can see, normal in our family is the only thing that's normal in our family. So let's celebrate this Christmas as if Graham were with us. I'm sure if he could call now or be here with us, he would be thrilled to have your company. When he gets back from his trip, he would love to visit each of you and exchange news in person." Well, and so on. Ella was embarrassed when some people who knew Graham intimately looked at her with puzzled looks. They obviously did not understand what news she was talking about. Graham never shared information about his current job with anyone. So, what other news would this couple have in store for them? Are they getting married? Ella sat back in her chair and dug her fork into the salad on her plate with exaggerated care, condemning herself in her thoughts for being impatient. How stupid of me. Why did I say something I should not have said about the news? No one can suspect anything yet, or they'll start asking questions, and Graham still knows nothing about our baby. Of course, she had said that phrase about the news because they would have to tell all their family and friends that they were having a baby. The housewarming party at the villa would no longer be a celebration because the news about the baby would be the most important thing for Ella and Graham and their family and friends. The intercom rang in the hallway. Ella looked in that direction, stood up from the table, and went to the machine. She was perplexed. They were not expecting anyone else. And who could have come uninvited in such a snowstorm? She pressed the intercom button, and the porter's voice came through. Ms. Anderson, can you come down to the lobby? There's someone here to see you." "Who?" asked Ella perplexedly. "I cannot say. You'd better go down to the lobby, then you'll see for yourself." Ella disconnected from the intercom and, throwing her sweater over her shoulders, turned from her mother, who had also come to the intercom. "Mom, I'll be quick. Someone's here and I'll see who it is." Ella walked out into the hallway to the elevator. No sooner had she reached it than the elevator doors opened, and Graham was standing in front of her, covered in snow that was melting right through his hair and face, covered with a day's worth of beard stubble. Ella was frozen in place with surprise and joy. Just before she could open her arms to hug Graham, he was already at her side, hugging her, kissing her hair, forehead, and neck. Ella was speechless with joy, and hugged him as if she would never let him go anywhere, ever again. Graham was the first to come to his senses, moved back a little, and holding Ella against him with outstretched arms, asked in a voice gray with cold. "So, are you doing okay?" Ella just nodded her head, looking at him lovingly. His blue eyes were melting her heart, and she could feel the warmth spilling into her heart and chest. Ella sighed, snuggled against Graham's chest again, and whispered, "I missed you so much. My darling." She continued, looking at him anxiously. "But how did you get here? It's such a snowstorm out there. It's dangerous." Graham, smiling embarrassedly, replied, "That's okay. Forgive me for going away and leaving you alone for Christmas. As you can see, I'm back. And we still have a couple minutes until midnight to celebrate it together." Just then, Ella pulled away from him and said a little mockingly, "And we're not the only ones here. Come home and you'll see." She led Graham by the hand, like a little boy, to the front door of their apartment. When she opened the door, the guests greeted Graham with a flurry of surprised exclamations. Around him, as always, a maelstrom of people swirled. Men came up to him and shook his hand. Women came up and hugged him too, and offered both cheeks for him to kiss. Ella stood back and watched Graham with a smile. He was trying to get away from the next lady he had to kiss on the cheek, and he looked at Ella guiltily. She was waiting for him. Now they were together again. And he could kiss every woman in the world on the cheek. He was with her, he was home. Finally, Graham freed himself from the embrace of another relative. Graham walked over to Ella, took her hands in his, and said,
Ella.
I unfortunately do not have a present. Ella gestured him not to continue, and touched his face affectionately with her hand, running it over his unshaven cheek, over the circles under his eyes from lack of sleep and the strain of the last 24 hours on the road. No, you need nothing. The main thing is that you are near me, that's the main gift to me. But Graham persisted. No, I still have a gift for you. It's just a slightly different gift. He pulled away from her, leaving Ella in bewilderment, went into the bedroom, and returned to the room a minute later. The guests had already gone about business, talking, eating, and drinking. Graham looked around the room, and at Ella standing in front of him. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders as if about to give a speech, and roared. Dear guests, may I have your attention, please? All heads immediately turned in their direction. Graham reached into the pocket of his jeans, took out something small, and suddenly got down on one knee in front of Ella. She was confused. Her imagination was filled with scenes of marriage proposals in romantic movies. And here it was. She was about to have her marriage proposal. Oh God! Her heart was going to burst with excitement. On one knee, Graham was already holding out to Ella in his vast palm a box covered with dark velvet. Ella took the box from his hand and opened it slowly. A cascade of sparks splashed at her. A diamond of extraordinary size and magnificent cut blazed like a living flame. Ella staggered back and looked at the ring and Graham in amazement. Graham was delighted with the effect the ring had on Ella. But the ring had to be used for its intended purpose. So Graham took the box from Ella's hands, took out the ring, and holding her left hand in his, still on his knee, said in a low, hoarse voice, Ella, will you be my wife? Ella, however, forgetting about the diamond and looking only into his eyes, was silent for a moment and replied quietly, taking Graham's other hand first. Yes, I'll be your wife. Everyone around me clapped and shouted, Bravo! Congratulations! Graham got up from his knees and kissed Ella on the lips, gently, but almost as if he owned her. Now, he was not shy about expressing his feelings for her in front of his family and others. She was now his future wife. This time, he was doing what a decent man should do when he finally started a family again. When the congratulatory went down, Ella led him over to the Christmas tree. The woman took her husband-to-be's hands in both hers and stood like that momentarily before breathing. I do not have a present for you either, a proper present. But there is one thing I can give you right now. We're having a baby. Graham pulled away from her, as if puzzled. It was as if he could not believe what she was saying. Ella looked at him anxiously, not understanding his reaction. But then the expression on Graham's face went from disbelief to amazement and joy. He hugged Ella. My dear. Is it true? Ella snuggled into his chest, whispered to him. Yes, really? What's the time limit? Asked Graham. Over 8 weeks. She said that now. Graham moved away from her, holding her by the shoulders and looking at her, said, How are you feeling? Is everything okay? Have you been to the doctor? Ella nodded at his every question and smiled. Everything sang in her soul. She had never imagined such happiness. All her senses were heightened, and she felt an extraordinary surge of strength and joy. Graham could see that she was glowing with happiness. "Here's a partisan, and so long without informing me of anything," he scolded her, pretending angrily, at the same time warmly, and suddenly somehow exaggeratedly cautious in embracing her. Ella replied, "Yes, I was afraid that something would go wrong again. And you were away on a business trip. I did not want to bother you if it did again. But you see, everything is fine now, and I'm so happy. Happy with you." Graham acts, lowering his voice even further. "You're too independent, my future wife. That's what you have me for. Now we have to share everything, joys and sorrows, all in half." He paused and asked her again.
"Who knows about that?"
Ella replied, also in almost a whisper.
"Only my parents."
"But now you're free to break the news to your parents, and anyone else you see fit." Graham, smiling, replied, "I'll only tell my parents, for now. Tomorrow. Today we celebrate Christmas and mark our engagement. Today is just that." Ella, taking Graham by both hands, replied, "All right, love." They stood by the tree, hugging each other for a long time, and did not notice that it was Christmas. Suddenly, everything outside the window went quiet. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered specially. The candles on the table flashed and straightened their lights, as if someone had flown into the room. It must have been the angel that brought happiness to Ella and Graham. It is happiness to be together and raise their child. It is happiness to feel the warmth of each other's love and family and friends. Happiness to live. The end.